I'm Nate. I've coached in Colorado for the last 7 years, and I frequently ventured into all sorts of debate across the state of Colorado. I most recently had the opportunity to run the DUDL 2019 Fall Workshop, where some of you might recognize me from, and I try to hop in and judge whenever I can. I've worked with and supported the Denver Urban Debate League for the better part of the decade now, and have been asked to help out by speaking on a couple of issues to all of you. I hope that this video greets you as excited debaters for what is surely going to be a great year, even if there are some ups and downs that are associated with it. First, I'm going to talk about what the fundamentals of argumentation is, along with how to really push your argument the extra mile. Second, I'll briefly discuss listening and understanding in debate, a concept that is, I think, surprisingly absent from a lot of debates that I see. And then finally, I'll end with just some words from one of the most famous debate coaches of all time on how to best demonstrate good decision-making in debate rounds. So let's start off with the fundamentals of building an argument. The activity of high school debate and the debates that like your parents think of or that you see on TV, maybe even during like the Trump-Clinton debates, are not at all similar, right? For those of you that are returning to the activity, you know that it's much more of a competitive forum type activity, while some of you that are new to the activity may not know that you are assigned what side you get to be on, as opposed to just taking up the stance of whatever you personally believe. But clearly, whether you're talking to a friend or having a heated conversation with someone that you don't like, there are certain strings of words and phrases and inflections on sentences that make people sound better or more convincing than other people that are also talking. And that's what I wanted to talk about in this video is, how to maximize the words and the arguments that we're using in debate rounds by knowing what constitutes a complete argument, knowing how to make those arguments sound really good, and by making strategic choices so that those first two have the maximum effect in the debate round. So let's talk about what it means to, win someone over with your words first. These are called the modes of persuasion, which are commonly referred to as ethos, pathos, and logos, which some of you may have heard, whether it was in like an argumentation class or if you've looked at these kinds of things, in the past. But typically, debate is viewed as a game that has us as debaters take turns attempting to persuade a third party that your side is correct, right? It is you versus your opponent, and then there is an independent party that is adjudicating who the winner was in this debate round. Typically this happens through a stringing of words that we all put together that somehow meet a threshold for what an argument is. But have you ever really thought about why it is that judges vote the way that they do, or how they reach that conclusion, or what they deem worthy enough to write down when they're trying to record what happens in the debate round? Even judges that you don't like probably have some metric that they follow when evaluating debate rounds. And if you keep losing in front of them, instead of getting frustrated, it may be more worthwhile and worth your time to think about these sorts of questions in order to change the result for the next time. So a long time ago, a dude named Aristotle wrote a book a lot of people were interested in called Rhetoric. Most people were interested in this book because Aristotle was teaching a guy named Alexander the Great, who is extremely famous. Aristotle was taught by Plato, who was taught by Socrates, both very famous people in their own rights. And in this book, he writes, persuasion is clearly a sort of demonstration, since people are most fully persuaded when we consider a thing to have been demonstrated. Of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. Persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character, when the speech was so well spoken as to make us think them credible. Secondly, persuasion may come through the hearers, when the speech stirs their emotions. And thirdly, persuasion is effected through the speech itself, when we have proved a truth or an apparent truth by means of the persuasive arguments suitable to the case in question. And that's all a lot of fancy words for basically the three things that we're going to be talking about, which are ethos, pathos, and logos. So for the first one, which is ethos, where Aristotle writes persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character, Ethos is when someone convinces the listener that the person speaking is someone who is credible to be talking about that issue. So, how much you want to believe or how much buy-in you have for the person speaking is like the largest factor for ethos. This is kind of the de facto method that a lot of judges and coaches use to describe performance in a debate round. If you're extremely rude to your opponent, one might not say that you have a very good ethos, and thus it would probably be less likely, the judge would be less likely to vote for your argument. Most of the debate is established on presenting yourself as a good speaker prior to even, the debate, like the event even beginning. It's kind of like the baseline for entering the activity. Some people, dress up to bolster their credibility, just like in a job interview. If you want someone to know that you're taking something seriously, dressing up or showing them that you are taking it seriously invites them to take it just as seriously as you are. And sometimes you need to do more than just speak with words, but with your actions and your body language. The second kind of, mode of persuasion here is called pathos, which Aristotle says may come through the hearers when the speech stirs their emotions. Emotions being the important part of this section. Pathos is an appeal to the emotional side. This can happen, through like a metaphor or a storytelling, or like a hook at the top of like an argumentative paper. It could be in the passion and the delivery of the speech writing, or when you're like calling to thoughts and feelings that you're sharing with the audience, or it could even be things like a personal anecdote. A lot of times when your teachers are telling you in like, an argumentative essay to have like a thesis line or a hook, this is kind of where we can start building up pathos in the speech, right? So for example, I have a couple different quotes here from author Dottie Smith in the book I Capture the Castle. They start the book with, "I write this sitting in the kitchen sink," leaving the reader, right, to try to interpret like, well, this person is writing a book, they're writing it in the kitchen sink, and all of a sudden, the thoughts and feelings that the listener has when they're listening to these kinds of, sentences, starts asking more questions, starts getting more buy-in, and ultimately are getting like bought into by the story. Another good example is from George Orwell's 1984. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13, where we see contrast between bright and cold, and all of that in contrast to April, where typically those days aren't very, cold in general. And the clocks are striking 13, where, a clock typically doesn't strike 13 because there's only 12 numbers on a clock. But all of these things are, invoking emotions in, what we as listeners to speeches, tend to listen to and start thinking about the words that you're saying. And so ultimately, pathos is much more than just, the kinds of words that you use, but it can also be the way that we choose to talk about it as well. So like fluctuations in tone or in volume of the speech can also have these kinds of effects. So like yelling or getting really loud and talking really deliberately when you're trying to prove anger or direct intent or urgency, or whispering, talking really quietly when you're trying to prove that there's sadness, or you're highlighting emotional intensity. And even just like changing the way in which you talk can portray different results in a speech that, we have to be thinking about when we're trying to talk in a competitive talking activity. Last but not least is logos, which Aristotle says is persuasion affected through the speech when we provide a truth or apparent truth. Logos is just an appeal to the logical side of the brain. Most of modern debate takes this just to mean like argument. And as you'll find out, later, hopefully in this video, this side of like logos is basically just an appeal to the factual. So like the factual, the substantive, the real, like what is true, right? You're attempting to make an argument about the state of the world, and you're using something to justify that. Where logos comes from and how it's determined to either like be or not be, or like where the threshold is for, how much true does something have to be in order for it to be considered true, is something that you could take years and years and years of college classes on and still not have an adequate answer on. But knowing that like someone is relying on evidence and logic to support their reasoning, definitely is persuasive to a lot of listeners because it makes them want to believe the things that that person is saying. Alongside with these like modes of persuasion, there's a couple others that I think are interesting that are worth talking about. One is called kairos, which is the timing of the speech. You can also think about this as like meta timing of a speech, where dramatic pauses, slowing down when you really have to get your point across. These things are used when someone wants to build up the drama, but specifically it's a type of timing technique used to get that purchase in a speech. The physical location and like chronological time of the speech can also take place or impact the speech when someone is giving it. So for example, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is a very, very, very good speech, but on top of that, it also had the right time and the right place. He started the speech with, a part of the Emancipation Proclamation on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on the March on Washington. All of these things combined meant that all of these things meant that people had, a lot of reason to want to buy into the speaker already. And then, to nail that speech right after that just meant that it really did go down as one of the greatest speeches in history. Last but not least on this one is mythos, and that's kind of like the story of the speech. A lot of kids that I've worked with in the past, I've told that debate is like storytelling, right? You kind of have to, tell a certain sequence of events on what is going to happen or something that would happen that we were trying to prevent in debate. And so that concept of impact calculus and storytelling is the mythos of the speech. Those parts are less talked about, mostly because ethos, pathos, and logos tend to encompass most of the things that we're talking about. But I just thought it would be interesting to talk about in the video here. So let's move on to the basis of argumentation. What are the parts of an argument? How do we tell if one is complete or not? I personally think that there are 3 easy steps to making a complete argument. It's a modified version of the full Tolman model of argumentation, which is something that is used by masters and doctoral students all across the world in order to justify their arguments. If you Google that phrase, you'll find a very convoluted 15-step document that it just provides justifications for justifications on an argument, which is just way too deep to go into when you've only got 8 or 5 minutes to speak, right? But I think that his whole model breaks down into one of 3 claims, or one of 3 parts, excuse me. The first part is a claim. This is also called the tag, or the tagline of an argument. Typically, it's the part of the argument that you want the judge to write down when they're following along throughout your speech. It's kind of strange that the claim is the first part of the argument, since it's also technically the conclusion. If what you're saying is true, then the claim as a result would be the concluding truth that we're left with, right? An example of this would be, when it rains, the sidewalk gets wet. I have made a statement that may or may not be true, and I certainly have provided no support for it, but if I were telling you reasons why the sidewalk got wet, then therefore I would conclude that the sidewalk was wet. However, in debate, we tend to put that at the beginning of a argument, and there will be a reason for that. Second is the data. This is the part where you introduce either a source, an experience, a known known, an unknown known, or a new fact in the debate round. A good way to think about this is the data that you bring with you in debates is all of the available tools that you have and all of the facts that you've proven thus far. If you want to use a different fact or bring in a different tool in the debate round, you have to read a new piece of data in order to establish and make arguments off of that. I think that data is the jump pad for argumentation, right? The best debaters can take facts from both sides and use it to win their own arguments by painting one consistent worldview. The last fundamental part of an argument is the warrant. This is the why behind the conversation, and I think it is the most important part of an argument. Most people lack nuance on this debate, but I find that the first best explanation of the issue is usually the person to win the debate here. Instead of just saying that global warming is the biggest impact and leaving it at that, say global warming is the biggest impact because not only does it affect everybody, but it would ultimately end up, shrinking land size across the entire world. Providing reasons for and describing in detail the why behind an argument gives that much more context and makes your argument that much more nuanced, so that the judge can, rationalize and make a decision for you. In this conversation, right, just in normal conversation, this can usually flow the opposite way of claim data warrant that we've talked about. So, for example, a sentence like Mark was born in Florida, and since if you were born in Florida, you'd be an American citizen, Mark is an American citizen, where I introduced, the warrant, the data, and then the claim. But in debate, it's much easier and cleaner, due to time pressures and trying to, organize the way that we're making an argumentative speech, to frame it in the claim data warrant way. Where instead, if I was making an argument about this, I would say, Mark is an American citizen. He was born in Florida, and all people born in Florida are citizens. And it may sound that I've just changed the words around, but one sounds a lot more natural in conversation, and one sounds a lot more natural in argumentation. And I think you'll see this, as you keep going through a debate. So, let's talk about what it means to listen to understand, and then how to appropriately argue after the fact, now that we know, what an argument is and how to be persuasive about it. This might just seem like some proverbial nonsense that people just say when they're talking about how to get better at debate, but if there's anything that I want you to walk away with from this video, it's this part and the next section. One of my good friends, Aurelia Williams, who's a brilliant coach that the Denver Urban Debate League had the opportunity to invite out for last year's workshop, explained debate to a group of new debaters like this one time. Debate is more like a board game than it is a verbal competition. Both teams take turns putting down pieces on the flow, and every speech we take turns moving them in order to beat your opponent. I think that this explanation in particular stuck with me for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's really helpful to think about your arguments as solid objects that you move throughout the debate and that you bring with you. For the visual learners out there, I think that even having things that represent your arguments, even if they don't really get used, is always helpful for me. I know that when I gave a speech personally, I had to have one piece of paper for each individual theme of an argument in that debate round, or I lost my mind. If it wasn't separated out and it wasn't oh, this is the first advantage, this is the second advantage, I just had a really hard time conceptualizing where I was supposed to be, what argument I was talking about at the same time, and it really messed with my pattern and my rhythm in debate. So trying to visualize it as things can really help in that that regard. If you have, and two, is if you have pieces, so does your opponent. Understanding what your opponent's pieces are saying, ways that they could be used, and preventing them from being deployed in the way that is the best for them, is probably the highest level thinking ability that debate can teach you. Knowing what your opponent's argument is helps you make smarter arguments against it. It also helps leverage your own arguments. And most importantly, it helps you beat the best version of the argument that your opponent could come up with. Judges are biased, even if we try not to be, right? If there's an argument that I just agree with fundamentally, even if it's entirely subconscious, it would be hard for that argument to lose in front of me, right? If it's just something that I personally believe in. Obviously, the best judges try to work against those kind of biases, but acknowledging those biases is a good first step to understanding why judges vote the way that they do. Looking at your opponent's evidence, asking about their arguments and their evidence during cross-examination and prep time. These are all things that can help you understand and take the sorts of precautions to preempt and stop their pieces from moving across the board. Things like even if statements help show that you have a much better understanding of the debate to the judge, where you can make arguments like, first of all, my opponent is wrong, and even if they're not wrong, here's why it wouldn't matter, is very good at developing your ethos and getting the judge to be more likely to vote for you. And lastly, third, losing pieces isn't the same as losing the game, and you're never going to have a perfect game in debate. losing a couple pawns in chess is fine if they were strategically conceded to gain an advantage elsewhere. Debate is exactly the same way. Not every issue in a debate round is just like, well, they said this, so I've got to say this. Instead of trying to make a huge yes-no issue out of every argument, it's probably worth your time to agree with your opponent on certain issues so that you can focus more on issues that you do find important. Arguments like on my argument about how we can solve global warming, my opponent had 10 reasons why it was locked in and unsolvable. We will agree to this. However, this only makes my second impact of nuclear war that much more likely. In a world rampant with climate change, we'll see more migration patterns, borders start to erode, and physical coastlines start shrinking. Paired with the erosion of resource availability of all these conditions, it makes the likelihood that a nuclear weapon could be launched higher than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even that sentence there sounded like I was making a smart argument to win the debate, but in reality I had conceded an entire argument my opponent made in order to try to make my other argument better. And not only does that happen through, focusing on what's the most important, but also by focusing my time on what's most important, which is the last thing that I wanted to talk to you all about today, which is how to demonstrate decision-making skills in speech and debate contexts. I've only got one bullet point down here, and that's because it is by far the most important. It is literally just called choose. Scott Deathridge, also known as the Duck, was the most winningest debate coach of all time. He was the director of Northwestern for over 20 years, and he was pivotal in the creation of the National Association for Urban Debate Leagues, including creating and hosting the first NAUDL tournament. He coached back-to-back-to-back wins at the National Debate Tournament, which is the College Policy Debate Tournament, and coached over 10,000 debaters, judged over 5,000 debate rounds, and really is considered one of the greatest, if not the single greatest, debate coach of all time. If you Google the Duck policy debate, in a video that's just called The Speech, he talks about something he calls the 13 processes of effective rebuttaling. I'd highly recommend watching that video if you're interested. It's fascinating, and I could never do that video justice due to how brilliant this guy was. That being said, the first of the 13, and the one that I think is the most important, is just one he calls as choose. It's just choose, which is something that is reflected in decision-making when arguing in debate. I honestly think that the Duck says this best, and I'm just going to read a portion of the choose speech here. Number 1, choose. Choose. If you leave this institute in this session with only a single principle in tow, make it this. Choose. The most essential lesson of effective rebuttaling is choice-making. No matter the speech, be it the 1NR or the 2AR or any point in between, no matter the argument type, be it critique, topicality, case, or counterplan, the first and most fundamental lesson of effective rebuttaling is choice-making. Young debaters, so anxious, every argument they consider to be they hang on. They think it to be important, especially in the rebuttals. But my experience is precisely opposite of that. Instead, it is the best arguments and the strongest points that make the effective rebuttalist the winning champion in the debate. As you begin each constructive speech, consider your alternatives. You lay out in the first negative speech a potpourri of alternatives, a variety of suggestions for the judge, and different ways for how you can approach winning the debate in the last speech. That said, you must, in the end, decide on an effective strategy for the judge. Choose for them what is the best avenue to prove conclusively that the coherent set or complete package of arguments you present as a totality in the last speech constitutes a way, a road, an avenue by which they achieve the effective end of concluding for the negative. Even great debaters sometimes take time to learn this lesson. I remember going back to my own final debate in the octafinals of the National Debate Tournament in 1984. We were debating one of the most respected teams in the country from Harvard, and we had an actual legitimate chance to win this debate. At the conclusion of the 1AR, it was my thought that we were, in fact, leading on all of the essential elements of the debate, topicality, our disadvantage, our case arguments, and our counterplan. Rather than making a choice, my own decision was to give the judge that same potpourri of selections headed into the 2AR. And the result was that the last affirmative rebuttalist was able to effectively close the debate in his favor conclusively and clearly because we had convinced the judge of a lot of nothing. I once coached a young man by the name of Michael Gottlieb, and for those of you, he's a extremely successful college debater. He is probably the most successful debater in some respects in the history of the National Debate Tournament. He won the tournament itself twice in 1998 and again in 1999. He was also the top speaker in each of those 2 years. In his senior year, he and his colleague won 43 out of 44 available ballots through the course of the tournament itself. He was debating in the semifinals before the last major tournament of his senior year prior to the NDT. I had listened to the debate in and out while I was judging next door, and our prep time was in sync. My instinct, in fact, against Northwestern's Fitzmere, who was their director of the debate at the time, my sense was that we were ahead on every critical argument in the debate. Mike came out, and I didn't hear the 2AR. I was judging. Mike came out, and I said, "What do you think?" Rather, I said, "What did you go for?" He said, "Everything." And I said, "Mike, lesson number 1." Sure enough, 30 minutes later, the decision was a 2-1 decision for the other team from memory. This section of the speech and the parts that I didn't read are played annually at the end of every Northwestern Forensics Institute, which is a very large and prestigious camp that strives at bringing the best from debate to people. I think that choosing deeper and fewer issues is preferable to going for every argument because, as the duck says, if you go for everything in the last speech, you end up convincing the judge a lot of nothing. As always, a special thanks to Jessica, Jillian, and Ruby for all of the wonderful work that they do in supporting the UDL, especially given COVID-19 and other trials that have been put in front of them in the recent past. I'd like to thank them for allowing me the opportunity to hopefully impart some of the wisdom that I picked up from people way smarter than me and asking me to speak to y'all via video on some of the most important issues that there are in speech and debate. I hope that everyone is safe despite these trying times, and I know it'll be students like you who have the opportunity to critically engage with issues in debate that will be our leaders for a better tomorrow. I wish you the best of luck this upcoming debate season, and I hope to hear more from all of you and the Denver Urban Debate League soon. Thank you.